The cottage stood at the ragged edge of the Fenland, a small structure of wattle and daub, whose walls had taken on the colour of old tea from years of peat smoke and damp air. You sat on a three-legged wooden stool close to the hearth, where a low fire of turf and split willow logs burned without flame, only a steady orange glow that pulsed when a draught slipped under the door. The single window, a square of oiled linen stretched across a rough oak frame, showed the last daylight draining from a wide pale sky, a band of deep amber sinking into the flat horizon, while the rest of the world turned blue and grey. Inside the cottage, the air was still and warm, thick with the scent of dried sedge, tarred cordage, and the faint animal smell of old wool. In your lap lay a coil of fine hemp netting that you were checking inch by inch, drawing it slowly through your fingers, your thumb running along the mesh to find any frayed knot or broken strand. The hemp was a soft brown, darkened here and there with the bloom of marsh mud that never quite washed out. You squinted slightly in the poor light, moving the net toward the ember glow, when a suspicious thinness caught your eye, and you found a tiny gap where two knots had pulled apart. From a small deal box at your feet, you took a bone needle and a length of tarred twine, both worn smooth from years of use, and you began to mend the hole with slow looping stitches, drawing each knot tight against the mesh with a muted creak of twisted fibre. Your hands knew this work so completely that your mind wandered far from the task, returning only to count the knots and measure the evenness of the repair. A man who has mended nets 10,000 times does not need to watch his fingers, and yours moved with a patience that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Around you, suspended from the low rafters, hung other nets of different sizes and shapes, some rolled like sausages and tied with leather thongs, others draped across poles to air. They cast complicated shadows on the lime-washed ceiling, and when the fire sputtered, the shadows shifted as though a breeze had passed, though the air indoors was perfectly still. Each net had its own faint smell, a blend of hemp, the marsh it had been dragged through, and the damp wool sacks they were stored in during the day. You paid them no particular attention. They were just part of the room, as familiar as the blackened kettle on its iron hook, or the dried bundles of reed mace hanging from a beam near the door. When the mend was finished, you tested the patch by pulling the mesh between your hands, feeling it hold firm with a tiny elastic give, and then you set the mended net aside on the floor and reached for the snares pouch. This was a soft leather bag that had once been the sleeve of a coat, and inside were dozens of slender horsehair nooses, each one carefully braided and finished with a loop at one end. You tipped them out onto a piece of sacking spread across your knees, and you began to go through them one by one, laying each noose flat, testing the slip knot with a gentle pull of the thumb, then threading the loop over a small wooden peg that you would later press into the fen peat. The pegs were cut from blackthorn shoots, thumb-thick and about the length of your hand, their ends rounded by the knife. You sorted the snares and pegs into pairs with the same unhurried rhythm, 36 pairs in all, until the sacking was covered with orderly little rows of wood and pale hair that glinted in the firelight like blonde thread. On a shelf against the back wall, just above a stack of dry turves, rested the things you would take out into the night. A canvas game bag folded neatly, a leather water bottle stained dark at the seam, a small sack of barley meal bread wrapped in a clean cloth, and a lump of hard cheese the size of your fist. Its rind yellow and waxed from age. You glanced at the shelf without really thinking, checking off each item the way you might count sheep on a far hillside, and then you returned your gaze to the fire. The turf had burned down to a bed of fine white ash, with a single glowing heart of peat that gave off no smoke, only a dry earthy warmth that seemed to make the cottage smaller and closer. Outside the window the orange band had narrowed to a thin line, and the sky above it was taking on the deep indigo that precedes a clear night. A single star had already appeared, hanging low in the east like a chip of ice. You rose from the stool slowly, your knee joints giving a soft crack that the cottage absorbed without echo, and you crossed to the wooden peg where your outdoor clothes hung. First you pulled on an extra woolen waistcoat, a faded rust-colored garment with bone buttons that had been carved from a sheep's shank, and you buttoned it from bottom to top with the same steady motion you used for everything else. Over that went a thick fustian coat, heavy and stiff at the shoulders, its pockets deep enough to hold a day's worth of small necessaries. You tugged the lapels straight, settled the collar against your neck, and then took your felt hat from its hook, a wide-brimmed hat of blank rough wool that had been reshaped by rain and sun until it fitted your head like a shell. You pulled it low over your brow, your ears vanishing under the brim, and for a moment you stood quite still in the middle of the floor, your hands hanging loose at your sides, your breathing shallow and slow. It was the hour when the fen outside went silent, the moment between the daytime birds and the nighttime creatures. You listened. Through the thick walls, you could hear the distant calling of a single curlew somewhere far off across the open marsh, a liquid note that rose and fell and hung in the air like a thread of silver, stretching itself out until it seemed it would break, and then it stopped, leaving a quiet so complete that you could hear the tiny settling of ash in the hearth. The curlew call was a signal you had heard on 1,000 evenings, and it told you everything you needed to know about the coming night. The sky would stay clear, the breeze would not rise, and the moon would come up full and round and bright enough to cast shadows on the open water. You bent down and gathered your gear. The mended net went over your left shoulder in a coil, the snares pouch went into the deep pocket of your coat, and the pegs went into a separate canvas roll that you tied with a bit of cord. The game bag, water bottle, bread and cheese you placed into a larger leather satchel, checking each fastening twice, tucking the straps tight with a soft rasp of leather against wool. The only light left in the cottage came from the dying fire and a single tallow candle set in an iron holder on the mantel shelf, its flame a steady teardrop that flicked when you passed before it. You lowered your head and blew it out with a single dampened finger, the wick sparking orange for a half second and then going dark, and a thin line of smoke rose straight up and vanished into the rafters. The door opened outward with a groan from the iron hinges that spoke of rust and age, and you stepped across the threshold into the cool twilight. Immediately, the air changed. It became soft against your cheeks in a way that indoor air never was, carrying the smells of sedge, standing water, and the clean mineral rot of fen vegetation turning slowly to peat. The ground outside the cottage was packed earth-worn smooth by the passage of feet, with a single rain barrel at the corner that glimmered faintly as the sky caught the last light. Beyond the cottage, the land fell away into a vast flatness of reed bed and open marsh that stretched on all sides to a horizon dissolved in grey haze. The reeds nearest the cottage stood waist-high and stiff, their feathery tops beginning to catch the first pale wash of moonrise, and further out they rose head-high or taller, a living wall that swayed in a breeze, too light to feel on your skin. The path leading from the door was a dark seam of pressed peat and trampled reed stems, as straight as a rule line, cutting directly into the fen. You paused on the doorstep to listen again, and this time there was only the immense wide silence of the marsh, broken now and then by the minute trickle of water moving somewhere out of sight, and the faint, dry rustle of leaves that were not leaves but reed blades touching one another. A little night mist was beginning to rise from the ditches, pale and low like a slow exhalation of the earth, and it curled around the base of the cottage and then drifted away toward the mere. You shifted the bundle of gear on your shoulder, feeling the balanced weight of net and satchel settle against your back, and you set off down the path toward the deeper fen, your boots sinking slightly into the damp peat with a sound that was more breath than squelch, a soft parting of wet soil that closed again behind you. The moon had not yet cleared the rim of the world, but its light was already slanting upward into the sky, tinting the lower edges of the scattered clouds with a faint silver that promised a full disk soon to rise. You walked slowly, your pace set by the pull of the load and the need to move without noise, and the cottage shrank behind you until it was only a low, dark shape with a thin whisper of white smoke still drifting from the chimney. Then a dark bump on the flat land. Then nothing at all. All around you now the fen opened out, a landscape made of horizontal lines, the reed tops, the water gleams, the long pale streak of the horizon, and above it the deepening bowl of the sky where more stars were appearing by the minute, small and sharp and completely still. A bittern boomed once from a hidden pool, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, a deep wooden thud that vibrated in your chest and then ceased, leaving behind a humming quiet. You walked on. The path entered a stand of reed sweet grass that reached over your head, and for a while you moved through a corridor of pale stems that rustled on either side, the sound accompanying you like a slow breath drawn in and out. The mist thickened here, blurring the tops of the reeds so that they seemed to float without roots, and your felt hat collected a fine layer of moisture that made the wool smell of wet sheep. You did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. The ducks would not come until the moon was high, and the snares could wait in your pocket, and the net could lie on your shoulder for another hour without harm. After some time, the reed bed thinned and you came to a small plank bridge over a black cut of water that flowed so slowly it mirrored the stars perfectly, each one a tiny point of light trembling on the surface. You crossed it with a hollow thud of planks, the sound absorbed at once by the soft ground on the far side, and you continued along a rise of slightly drier ground where tufts of bolt cotton nodded like white flags in the dimness. The track here was marked by an old willow stump whose bark peeled away in long dry curls, a landmark you could have found blindfolded, and you rested for a moment with your hand on its rough top, feeling the cool, crumbling wood under your palm. Your breath was even, your heart beating with the slow, steady rhythm of a clock running down, and you looked up at the sky to gauge the time. The first pale rim of the moon was just now pushing above the far line of the horizon, enormous and orange gold, a harvest moon even in early autumn, and it sent a long stripe of quivering light across every patch of open water within sight. You watched it lift slowly, so slowly that the movement was invisible, and you knew that in another hour it would be small and white and high enough to light the whole mere like a lantern. Satisfied, he took up your bundle again and walked on, the path now turning toward the larger pool where the wildfowl would gather. The calling of the curlew came once more, so far away it was barely a vibration in the air, and then the night fell completely silent except for the soft sound of your boots on the earth, a sound that went on and on and on into the darkness. The track away from the cottage was little more than a dark seam of pressed peat weaving through tall stands of reed and sedge, and your boots sank very slightly with each step, making a low sound that the vast flatness swallowed instantly. It was not a squelch, but something softer, a whisper of wet soil parting and closing, and after a dozen paces it became as regular as breathing, a rhythm that required no thought at all. The moon had not yet cleared the rim of the earth, though its light already spilled over the edge of the sky, coloring the reed beds with a faint silver wash that deepened as you walked. The reeds nearest the path were mostly common reed, thick-stemmed and grey-green in daylight, but now only pale silhouettes, their feathery heads nodding together whenever a breeze too soft to feel passed through them. That nodding produced a papery rustle that seemed to travel for miles, a sound that started somewhere to your left and moved slowly rightward, like a wave crossing an inland sea, dying out and then beginning again further off. You walked through it without breaking stride, your felt hat and the bundle on your shoulder making you a dark shape among other dark shapes, indistinguishable from any other slow-moving thing in the fen. The twilight stage between sunset and moonrise was a peculiar time on the marsh, when colours drained away, but shadows had not yet reformed. The path ahead was a ribbon of deeper darkness against the general grey, and you followed it by feel as much as by sight, your boots knowing the way even when your eyes were deceived by a patch of pale sand that looked like water, or a skin of water that looked like solid ground. On either side the ditch water lay black and still, reflecting nothing yet except a diffuse paleness where the sky was brightest. In another half hour that same water would be a mirror for the moon and every star, but for now it was simply a void, a nothingness that made the reeds seem to float in mid-air. You passed the old willow stump, its bark peeling away in long dry strips like the scrolls of ancient paper, its shape so familiar that you angled your shoulders to avoid a low projecting branch without conscious decision. A wren had once nested in a crack of that stump 2 summers ago, and the memory surfaced, and then sank again in your mind without leaving a ripple. The path continued straight, then bent gently left around a patch of bog myrtle, whose scent, crushed by the passage of some earlier animal, rose sweet and sharp and medicinal, hanging in the air for 3 steps and then fading into the general smell of wet peat. Your gear weighed on you with a comfortable pressure, the coil of netting across your left shoulder, the satchel strap crossing your chest, the snares pouch bumping softly against your thigh inside the deep coat pocket. You adjusted nothing, because nothing needed adjusting. You had packed and carried these same items in this same arrangement, so many times that your body had grown around them, the way a tree grows around a fence wire. The night air was cool but not cold, cool enough to keep the mist low and to make your breath visible as a faint cloud for half a second before it vanished, and the coolness felt clean in your lungs, clean and slightly damp, like inhaling over a basin of spring water. Overhead the sky had deepened to a color that was neither blue nor black, but something between, a dense indigo that held the first scattering of bright stars. The constellation of the Plough hung low in the north, its handle pointing toward the horizon, and a single planet flared white and steady in the west, so bright that it cast its own tiny reflection on the nearest ditch water as the moonrise caught up with its early promise. You observed these things without naming them, the way a sailor reads the sky without reciting the names of stars, simply absorbing the information that the night would stay clear and the wind would not rise. The path led you now into a stretch where the reeds grew taller, 10 or 12 feet high, their stems as thick as your little finger and packed so densely that you walked through a corridor of rustling walls. Here the light was dimmer, the moon still too low to penetrate the narrow way, and you moved by the feel of the ground under your feet. The slight camber of the path that had been built up over generations of fowlers going this way and that. The peat here was springy, almost elastic, and it bounced back after each footstep with a tiny resilient sigh. You could smell water very close, not the stagnant water of a forgotten ditch, but the clean, open water of the mere, a smell that was cold and faintly mineral, like wet stones. The sound of the reeds changed too, from a dry rustle to a softer swishing as the stems grew greener and more flexible near their bases. A bittern called once from deep cover, a low booming note that sounded like a cow trapped in a hollow log, and the call was so deep that you felt it in your breastbone before you heard it with your ears, a vibration that lingered after the sound itself had stopped. Then the fen went quiet again, a quiet so profound that you could hear the tiny ticking of night insects in the reed stems, a sound like very distant knitting needles. You crossed a second plank bridge, narrower than the first, just 2 alder poles lashed together with tart cord and laid across a dark cut of water that barely moved. The poles dipped slightly under your weight, and the little water welled up through the gap and wetted the soles of your boots before you stepped off onto the far bank. Here the path divided into 3 faint tracks, unmarked except for a broken wattle hurdle leaning against a thicket of blackthorn. You stopped for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but out of habit, letting your breathing settle after the long walk while you looked at each of the 3 ways in turn. The left-hand track was the driest, rising slightly to a ridge of sandy soil where marsh orchids grew in the spring, and it led to the largest of the mares, the one you wanted tonight. The center track went to a smaller pool that was good in winter when the big water froze over. The right-hand track petered out in a bog that was only worth visiting when the snipe were running. You took the left track without further thought, stepping around the broken hurdle, and within 50 paces the reeds began to thin again, and the sense of open space returned, the sky widening overhead and the breeze, such as it was, touching your cheek with the cool breath of the water ahead. Far off, so faint it was almost imagination, you heard the distant yelping of a vixen, a single flat note that was answered by another, even further away, and then silence. The moon had now cleared the horizon entirely, and it was no longer orange, but a pale buttery yellow, shrinking as it climbed, its light hardening from a glow to a beam. It cast your shadow on the path ahead of you, a long, thin shape that stretched and contracted as the ground rose and fell, a companion that walked before you without sound. You could see the texture of the path now, the individual reed stems pressed flat by your passage, the tiny puddles in old boot prints that the moon had turned to discs of silver, the scattered droppings of marsh deer that looked like dark beans scattered on a plate. A flock of starlings, disturbed from their roost in a distant reed bed, rose up in a soft whirring cloud that swirled and then settled again, their chatter a brief disturbance that smoothed over quickly. You walked on, your pace the same steady amble that had carried you from the cottage door, unhurried, unvarying, a pace that seemed to make no progress because the landscape never changed, only the moon rising higher and the stars growing brighter and the mist spreading thicker in the low places. Time on the fen did not pass in minutes, but in shifting degrees of light and shadow, and you were so much a part of that slow clock that you felt no impatience, no urge to arrive, only the continuous present of walking. The ground grew softer again as you approached the mere, the sandy ridge, giving way to a peaty hollow where water stood in shallow pools among the tussocks of reed sweetgrass. Your boots made deep prints here, each one filling at once with dark water that reflected the moon for a moment before the mud clouded it over. You skirted the wettest patches by instinct, stepping on the low hummocks of grass where the footing was firmer, and the detour added a few minutes to the walk without your noticing or caring. The air was thicker here, saturated with the smell of wet peat and the clean, fresh scent of watermint that grew in a dense mat along the edge of a small runnel. You knelt by the runnel for a moment, cupping one hand to scoop up a mouthful of cold water that tasted of roots and iron, and then you rose and continued on your way, wiping your palm on the skirt of your coat. The runnel trickled away behind you with a sound like a very small bell, and then it was gone, and there was only the path again, the reeds, the moonlight, the vast dome of the sky. After another quarter hour of steady walking, the reeds began to open, not suddenly, but by gradual subtraction, the stems on either side growing shorter and sparser until you could see over them to a wide grey expanse of water. You slowed without meaning to, your pace dropping to a saunter, and then you stopped altogether at the edge of the mere. The water stretched away before you 200 paces across or more, a broad, shallow pool ringed entirely by a wall of reed and bulrush that seemed to hold the moonlight cupped in a dark bowl. The surface was not perfectly still. A faint shiver passed over it now and then, a catspaw of breeze too small to feel on your skin, and each shiver sent the moon's reflection trembling into 1,000 thin lines of silver that merged back into a disk. A moment later, patches of water plantain and broad-leaved pondweed broke the surface in ragged islets, their leaves lying flat like green coins, and near the far bank a fallen alder tree extended a long white limb into the water, its bark bleached by years of sun and flood. The whole scene was a map of quiet information, a language you had learned so long ago that you no longer remembered learning it. You stood with your hip leaning against a young alder sapling that would one day be a tree, and you let your eyes range across the water, reading the signs that the mere offered up to the moonlight. A faint V-shaped ripple, far to the left, told you a moorhen had slipped out of the weeds and was paddling toward the center. A constellation of tiny bubbles rising near a tussock of reed sweetgrass betrayed a feeding eel, its body coiling in the black mud below. A single bat flickered across the water in a flight like a stitch being pulled out of cloth, and then it was gone into the reeds. You watched the sky too, noting the path of high thin clouds that would not thicken or cover the moon, and you listened for the distant whisper of wings that would announce the wildfowl coming in from their daytime resting grounds, but heard nothing yet, only the immense soft hum of the fen at night. Your heart beat slowly. Your hands rested quiet at your sides. The net and the game bag and the snares waited with you, patient as stones, and the moon rose higher and grew smaller and whiter, and the water before you lay open and empty and ready. After an hour of steady walking, the reeds opened, not with a dramatic parting, but by a gradual subtraction, the tall stems on either side growing shorter and sparser until you could see over their nodding heads to a wide grey expanse of water that lay ahead like a sheet of dark hammered metal under the climbing moon. You stopped at the precise edge where the path ended and the mere began, a place marked by a leaning alder sapling whose roots gripped the bank with pale, gnarled fingers. The pool was broad and shallow, nearly 200 paces across, and it had lain unchanged in this hollow since long before the Romans dug their first drainage dikes. It was ringed entirely by a dense wall of reed and bulrush that held the moonlight cupped in a dark bowl, and in its center the water was scarcely knee-deep, so that patches of soft bottom mud and flat leaves of water plantain broke the surface in ragged islets that looked like scattered pieces of felt. The surface was not completely still. A faint shiver passed over it at intervals, a catspaw of breeze too light to feel on your skin, and each shiver sent the moon's reflection trembling into 1,000 thin lines of silver that merged back into a disk a moment later. You stood with your hip leaning against the sapling and let your eyes range across the water, reading the night's signs with a patience that had no need of a clock, fitting yourself into the huge slow quiet of the mere rather than imposing any urgent purpose upon it. For a long time you did not move. The sapling's bark was cool and smooth against your coat, and your weight pressed a shallow depression into the soft peat, where countless other fowlers had stood before you. A faint V-shaped ripple far to the left, near a stand of bulrushes so dark they were almost black, told you a moorhen had slipped out of the weeds and was paddling toward the center with small nervous jerks of its head. You watched the ripple travel and then fade, the water smoothing over as though the bird had never been. Near a teal bank, by a tussock of reed-sweet grass that bent low under its own weight, a constellation of tiny bubbles rose one by one and broke without sound, betraying a feeding eel that was coiling through the black mud below. The bubbles glinted like seed pearls in the moonlight, and then they stopped, and the water became dark again. A single bat flickered across your field of vision in a flight like a stitch being pulled from cloth, so quick that it was gone before you could turn your head. The sky overhead was a deep indigo now, fully dark, and the stars were so thick and fine that they looked like flour spilled on slate. High, thin clouds drifted across them without ever covering the moon, their edges silvered, but their centers dark, moving to the east with a slowness that matched your own breathing. You listened carefully for the distant whisper of wings that would later announce the wildfowl coming in from their daytime resting grounds. But you heard nothing yet except the immense soft hum of the fen at night, the tiny tick of insects in the reed stems, and the occasional plop of a water drop falling from a raised reed blade. The whole scene was a map of small quiet information that you translated without haste. The moorhen's ripple, the feeding eel's bubbles, the path of the thin clouds, the absence of wing beats. These were the words of a language you had learned so long ago that you no longer remembered learning it. You simply knew, without stating it to yourself, that the night would stay clear, that the wildfowl would come when the moon was higher, and that you had time enough for everything that needed doing. The fen asked nothing of you but stillness, and you gave it, standing with your hands loose at your sides, and your eyes half-lidded against the brightness of the moon on water. After a long interval, a stretch of time that might have been a quarter hour or half of one, you straightened from the sapling and lowered your bundle to the ground. The grass here was short and tussocky, a mix of meadow grass and the flat rosettes of plantain, and it was dry enough to sit on. You knelt on one knee, the damp coolness soaking through the wool of your breeches at once, and you untied the leather strings that held the main bundle closed. The strings were old and supple, darkened with years of marsh mud and hand grease, and the knot came loose with a single tug that you performed without looking, your fingers knowing the work. Inside the bundle lay the biggest net, the one you would set in a crescent curve around the open water, and it was folded in layers with the cork floats and stone weights tucked carefully in the center so they would not foul the mesh. You lifted it out with both hands, the hemp rustling softly like a whispered secret, and you began to lay it out along the grassy bank, stretching its length foot by foot to find any tangles before you carried it to the water's edge. Your movements were so slow they seemed dreamlike, as though the night air had thickened into a gentle syrup that resisted every gesture. You pulled one fold open, then another, the net sliding through your hands with a soft sibilant whisper, and the cords cast complex fleeting shadows on the moonlit grass, shadows that shifted and dissolved and reformed each time you moved. The mesh was a pattern of tiny diamonds, each one the width of your thumb, and you checked each diamond by letting the moonlight shine through it, watching for any gap or snag. You found a small twig caught in one knot, and you worked it loose with your thumbnail, flicking it away into the reeds, where it landed with a faint tick. The cork discs bobbed against your palm, each one pierced with a hole through which the top cord ran, and they smelled faintly of the wine barrels they had been cut from. The stone weights were smooth ovals of chalk, sewn into little linen pouches that had gone grey with age, and they made a gentle clinking sound when they touched one another, a sound like distant pebbles. When the net lay fully extended along the bank, a long dark line that stretched perhaps 30 paces from end to end, you walked slowly along its length, stooping every few feet to adjust a fold or straighten a twisted cord. The moon was high enough now that the whole bank was bright, the grass blades casting thin shadows like strokes of ink, and you could see every detail of the net, the tightness of the knots, the evenness of the mesh, the way the floats and weights lay at precise intervals. You tested the tripcord, a separate length of thicker hemp that ran from the center of the net to the iron ring you would later peg into the ground, and you found it sound, its fibers tight and springy. Satisfied, you left the net lying on the bank and walked back to your bundle to take out the wooden stakes. These were 15 in number, each one cut from a hazel sapling and sharpened to a blunt point, and you stacked them in a neat pile beside the net, counting them under your breath with a murmur that was barely a sound. A light breeze, the first you had felt since leaving the cottage, stirred the reed tops across the mere and carried the faint, sweet smell of water mint, and it passed as softly as it had come, leaving the air still again. You stood for another long moment looking out at the water. The moon was now a handspan above the far reed line, small and white and bright enough to cast sharp shadows, and its reflection lay on the surface of the mere like a plate of polished pewter. The moorhen had vanished into the weeds, the bubbles from the eel had ceased, the bat had gone elsewhere. In the immense quiet you heard your own breathing, slow and even, the air entering your nose with a coolness that you could feel all the way down, and you let your shoulders drop and your jaw loosen. There was nothing to do but wait and prepare, and the preparing was itself a kind of waiting, an extension of the stillness into action. You knelt again and began to gather the net into a loose pile that you could carry to the water's edge, looping it over your arm coil by coil, the cork floats knocking together with soft hollow taps, the stones weighing it down against your thigh. The net was heavy but not burdensome, and you lifted it easily, your body accustomed to the weight, and you turned toward the mere and took the first careful step down the sloping bank into the cold water. You stepped down to the waterline where the peat was spongy and cool water welled up around your boot heels, soaking through the leather in a slow seep that felt cold and clean. The bank shelved gently, a slope of black mud mixed with rotted reed stems, and you went carefully, placing each foot flat so as not to stir up clouds of silt that would take an hour to settle. The water near the edge was barely an inch deep, a thin skin of silver over the dark ooze, and it lapped against your soles with a sound so faint it was more a sensation than a noise, a tiny cold caress that repeated with every step. You carried the main net bundled in your arms, a long curtain of fine hempen mesh weighted along its bottom edge, with small, smooth stones sewn into linen pouches and buoyed at the top with discs of cork bark, and the bundle was heavy enough that your shoulders had begun to ache with a dull warmth that was not unpleasant. The moon was fully up now, small and white and bright as polished bone, and its light fell so strongly on the surface of the mere that you could see the tiny water beetles rowing themselves among the duckweed, their legs working in steady, mechanical strokes that left no wake. The fine hairs on the backs of your own hands gleamed silver when you moved them, and the net in your arms cast a tangled shadow on the water that shifted and slid like a living thing. You stopped near the base of a large clump of reed mace that grew at the water's edge, its flat green leaves splaying outward, and its dark brown seed heads standing stiff and erect, like the heads of pickerstaffs. This clump would serve as the anchor point for one end of the net, a natural feature that a duck's eye would accept without suspicion. You set the bundle down on a tussock that rose just above the waterline, the grass pricking your wrists, and you began to free the net from its own folds, working with the same slow patience you had used on the bank. The hempen cords were cold and slightly damp, and they uncoiled with a soft, whispering sound. The cork floats, knocking together with hollow taps, the stone weights making a gentle clinking like distant pebbles. You took the first end of the net and looped it around the base of the reed mace clump, tying it off with a knot that you could release with a single pull, a knot you had tied so many times your fingers performed it while your mind drifted elsewhere. The moon, reflected on the water beside you, was a broken disk that reformed every time the slight ripple from your movements passed. Once the first end was secure, you began to pay the net out inch by careful inch, wading slowly backward into the mere. The water deepened to mid-calf, cold now but not numbing, and your boots pressed into the soft bottom with a squelch that was muted by the water into a sound like a slow exhalation. You held the net just above the surface, your arms extended, letting it drape over a line of cut reeds that you had bent down earlier to form a low hidden fence, a trick of the Fenland Fowler that turned the natural vegetation into a support that would hold the mesh at exactly the right height. The bent reeds were still green and flexible, and they accepted the weight of the net without springing back, their stems bowed but not broken. You moved along the fence inch by inch, your hands paying out mesh with a motion so steady it was almost hypnotic, the net descending onto the reed supports like a long exhalation. The top cord with its cork floats riding just a few inches above the water, the bottom cord with its stone weights sinking just below the surface. The mesh itself, stained a soft brown by age and marsh water, became nearly invisible against the dark water and the shadowed reeds. A ghost net that would be seen only if you knew exactly where to look. Every 10 yards you stopped to press a wooden stake deeper into the ooze with the heel of your hand, leaning your weight onto it until it was planted as firmly as a fence post. Each stake had been cut from a hazel sapling and sharpened to a blunt point, and the wood was smooth under your palm, polished by years of use. You tested every stake's firmness by pulling back on it slightly, feeling the resistance of the mud, and then you tied the net's guide cord to it with a quick half hitch that cinched tight and held. Between stakes, you adjusted the droop of the net, studying the way the mesh hung, ensuring it had exactly the right slack, neither too taut to betray its unnatural straightness to a wary duck, nor too loose to allow a bird to swim through a sagging gap. This adjustment required a particular attention, a quiet focus that occupied your whole mind without rushing it, and you moved from section to section, pinching a fold of mesh here, teasing out a tight spot there, stepping back each time to see the whole arrangement with your head tilted and your eyes half closed. The moon rode high enough now that the water was a field of silver, and your net was a long dark crescent curving around a section of open water, a patient trap that would wait with you until the ducks arrived. When you reached the far end of the curve, the net had described a shape like a new moon, its two ends anchored to the bank nearly 40 yards apart, and its belly curving out into the mere. You tied off the final end to another clump of reed mace, this one smaller and younger, its leaves bright green even in the moonlight, and you stood for a moment in the water, your hands empty, your arms hanging loose at your sides. Your lower body was cold now, the water having drawn the heat from your legs in a steady, subtle drain. But it was a cold you were accustomed to, a cold that would not harm you, so long as you kept moving slowly. Water beetles were still rowing among the duckweed, their tiny oar-strokes producing minute spreading rings that intersected and cancelled one another, and a great water snail was moving across a submerged reed stem with a pace so slow its progress was only visible if you looked away and then looked back. The fine hairs on your hands, still gleaming silver, were beaded with tiny drops of water that caught the moonlight like a dusting of frost. You waded back to the bank, stepping onto the tussock where you had left the rest of your gear, and the water ran from your boots in thin rivulets that darkened the dry grass. The tripcord lay coiled beside the iron ring you had brought, a length of thicker hemp that would connect the net to your hand and allow you to pull it closed when the moment came. You picked up the cord and the ring, the iron cold and rough with rust, and you drove the ring into the ground at the edge of the tussock with a single sharp push, the metal sinking into the peat with a soft crunch of roots. The ring sat firmly, its eye pointing up at an angle, and you threaded the tripcord through it from below, drawing the cord up and through with a hiss of hemp against iron that was the loudest sound you had made all night. You pulled the cord tight and then relaxed it, testing the friction, assuring yourself that the cord would run freely when you tugged it later. The free end you coiled neatly on the ground beside the spot where you would later sit, arranging the loops so that they would not kink or snarl, tucking the very end under the coil so that it could be found in the dark by feel alone. With the tripcord set, you turned your attention to concealing every trace of the apparatus. Any wildfowl coming in from the sky, scanning the water with those sharp round eyes that could see a spider on a leaf from 50 yards up, would notice anything that looked out of place, a straight line, a bright speck, a shadow that moved against the wind. You'd hidden the net itself against the dark water and the reed supports, but the tripcord still ran from the ring to the water's edge, a pale line that might catch the moonlight. You walked away along the bank and broke 2 armfuls of fresh reed stems, choosing only the greenest ones that would not snap or crackle under your hands, their sap smelling sweet and faintly like cut grass. These you carried back and scattered artfully across the tripcord, laying each stem at a slight angle so that it looked as though the wind had dropped it there, stepping back and studying the arrangement, then stepping forward to adjust a stem that was too straight, turning it so that its shadow broke the line more naturally. You worked with a slow deliberation that had no room for impatience, breaking more reeds when the first armfuls proved insufficient, scattering them along the entire length of the cord until the pale hemp vanished entirely beneath a litter of dark stems and leaves that looked as though they had lain there for days. When the cord was hidden, you turned your attention back to the net itself. A floating cork had drifted slightly out of position, its pale disk too bright against the dark water, and you waded back in to nudge it lower, tucking it behind a natural reed stem so that it was visible only as a vague roundness. A fold of mesh near the center had draped itself over a reed support in a way that created a small telltale shadow, and you lifted the mesh with one finger and let it fall more softly, eliminating the shadow. You moved around the entire curve of the net, checking each section with the same painstaking care, your body bending and reaching with the slow precision of a man who was not tired and not hurried, a man whose whole night consisted of this one task and nothing else. The moon moved a little further across the sky, the stars turned imperceptibly around the pole, and you adjusted a floating cork here, drew a fold of mesh a little lower there, until the whole apparatus blended into the moon-shadowed reeds, so completely that you yourself could barely detect it, even though you knew exactly where every inch of it lay. Satisfied at last, you waded back to the tussock and sat down heavily, your back against the alder sapling, your legs stretched out before you with the wet boots glinting in the moonlight. The cold in your legs began to ease now that you were out of the water, replaced by a slow returning warmth that prickled the skin. You reached into the canvas bag and drew out the leather water bottle, its seams darkened with years of damp, and you pulled the wooden stopper with a soft pop and took a short drink. The water was lukewarm from riding against your body all evening, and it tasted faintly of leather and the iron tang of the bottle's rivets, but it was wet and it eased the dryness in your throat. You swallowed twice, slowly, feeling the water travel down, and then you stoppered the bottle and set it aside. You broke off a corner of the barley bread and chewed it without haste, the bread dense and slightly gritty with stone-ground meal, its taste nutty and plain. A single crumb fell onto your coat and you picked it off with your thumb and ate it. Somewhere far out on the fen, beyond the far wall of reeds, a vixen barked a single flat note, a sound like a rusty hinge, and it hung in the air for a moment and then fell silent. The silence after it was immense, a silence that had weight and texture pressing against your ears. You leaned your head back against the sapling and looked up at the sky, where the moon now stood nearly at its zenith, a small white disk that seemed to look down on the mere with a calm indifference that matched your own. Your hands lay loose in your lap, the fingers slightly curled, still bearing the faint imprint of net cords and wooden pegs. Your breathing was slow and deep, the air cool in your nose and warm when it left your lips, and you let your eyes drift across the water one more time. The net was invisible. The tripcord was hidden. The mere lay open and waiting, dark and silver, still and silent, and somewhere out beyond the horizon the ducks were resting through the high part of the night, soon to rise and come to you on the sound of their own soft wings. Leaving the main net stretched and ready along its crescent of hidden stakes, you straightened up slowly, your spine uncurling one vertebra at a time, and you stood for a moment on the grassy bank with the cold water still trickling from the eyelets of your boots. Your hands, wet from adjusting the floats, you wiped once down the front of your coat, and then you turned away from the mere and walked inland a dozen paces to where the ground rose into a drier margin, a strip of sandy peat that ran like a low shelf between the open water and the tall reeds. Here the moonlight fell differently, less reflected and more direct, so that every tussock of marsh grass and every half-buried stick cast a sharp black shadow. The air was a little warmer here away from the water, and it smelled differently too, less of minerals and more of dry sedge and crushed herbs, the scent of a place that was wet only part of the year and spent the rest of its time slowly baking under the Fenland sun. You knelt on one knee and opened the canvas roll of wooden pegs, spreading it flat on the ground. The pegs were cut from blackthorn shoots, each one thumb-thick and about the length of your hand, their ends rounded by the knife and their surfaces worn smooth from being pressed into peat 100 times. They were all the same color, a dark honey brown that looked nearly black in the moonlight, and they were cool to the touch, holding the chill of the night deep in their grain. You counted them without haste, touching each one with a forefinger as your lips moved silently, and you found 23 in the roll, enough for the first run of channels. From your coat pocket, you drew out the snares pouch and tipped a quantity of horsehair nooses onto the canvas beside the pegs. The loops of pale hair curling like tiny sleeping snakes. Each noose was a braid of 15 or 20 strands of tail hair from a grey mare, twisted tightly and then allowed to relax so that it held a springy curve, and each one ended in a small slipknot that ran free under the lightest pressure. You picked up the first noose and tested it by pulling the loop through your fingers, feeling the faint squeak of twisted hair, the sound dry and thin and as clean as a blade of grass splitting. The narrow, muddy channels where you would set these snares began a few yards to your left, cutting through the reed bed like little lanes made for creatures much smaller than a man. They were no wider than your forearm, some of them, and they twisted and branched in patterns that seemed random but were not. They were the pathways of water voles and moorhens and the nighttime padding of marsh deer, worn smooth by the passage of feet and bellies and the probing bills of wildfowl in search of grit. In the daylight these channels would be a rich green-brown, the mud soft and glistening, but under the moon they were ribbons of silver grey, their damp surfaces catching the light at angles that made them glow like pewter. You walked to the nearest channel and stood over it, studying its shape and direction, noting the place where a small tuft of sea rush grew on one bank and a depressed hoofprint, probably from a roe deer, was pressed into the mud on the other. The hoofprint was a perfect oval filled with dark water, and a single fallen reed leaf lay across it like a bridge for a spider. You knelt again, this time with both knees in the damp grass, and you took a peg from the roll and a noose from the pile. The first peg you drove into the peat with a rhythmic push and twist of the wrist, not hammering it, but working it in with a steady pressure that met the resistance of the soil, and then found the exact depth where the peg stood firm, solid enough to hold a bird, but loose enough to be pulled free with one hand when you returned. The soil here was soft but not spongy, a mix of sand and rotted reed stems that gave way with a gentle crunch, and the peg settled into it with the satisfaction of a key sliding into a lock. You wiggled it once to test it, found it secure, and then tied the end of the horsehair noose to the peg with a simple slip knot that you drew tight with a soft squeak. The same dry sound as before, repeated and then gone. The noose you then half opened and suspended across the little path, holding it in position with a split reed stem that you cut from a nearby culm, splitting it with your thumbnail and wedging the ends into the mud on either side of the channel. The noose hovered an inch above the ground, a tiny oval of pale hair that was barely visible in the twofold light of moon and water reflection, a gossamer circle that would tighten around the leg or neck of any bird that stepped through it. You adjusted it once, nudging the split reed a hair to the left, and then you sat back on your heels to study the arrangement. It was perfect. It was the same arrangement you had made thousands of times, and it was never any more or less than what was needed. You rose, picked up the roll of pegs and the pile of nooses, and moved to the next channel, 10 paces further along the margin. This one was slightly wider, with a mud bottom that had cracked a little as it dried, the cracks forming a web of fine dark lines like the glaze on an old pot. A scatter of tiny snail shells, white and empty, lay along one edge where a bird had previously fed. You knelt again, placed the peg to the left of the channel this time, where a low tuft of marsh grass would hide it from any eye coming from the water, and you drove the peg in with the same slow push and twist. Another noose was tied, another split reed cut and wedged, another gossamer loop suspended. You adjusted the height of the loop so that it sat just above the cracked mud, and you blew on it very gently to make sure it swung free and did not catch on any blade of grass. The loop trembled and then stilled. You moved on, time on the fen, which had already stretched itself into a slow, elastic present, now began to assume a different texture altogether as you worked your way along the drier margin from channel to channel. The task of setting snares was repetitive in a way that dissolved thought, each action identical to the last, and yet each one absorbing your full attention because the channels themselves were all slightly different, each one demanding a tiny adjustment of peg placement or loop height or the angle of the split reed that held the noose. Your body fell into a rhythm that was not unlike the rhythm of walking. Kneel, push peg, tie knot, cut reed, suspend noose, test, rise, walk, kneel again. The rhythm was so steady that it became a kind of quiet music, a pattern of small motions that your muscles knew by heart, leaving your mind free to drift across the surface of the night like a water beetle skimming a pond. You thought of nothing in particular, and the nothing was peaceful, a wide grey emptiness that matched the fen around you. The moon climbed higher and grew smaller and whiter. The stars wheeled imperceptibly. The mist in the low places thickened and then thinned as the slight breeze came and went. At the fourth channel, you found the hoof print of a roe deer pressed deep into the peat, so fresh that the edges were still sharp and a little water was still seeping into it from below. The deer had come down to drink not long before sunset, and its track crossed the channel and went on into the reeds on the far side, a faint trail of pressed stems that you could follow with your eye for 10 or 12 yards before the moonlight lost it. You placed a snare on either side of the hoof print, the loops suspended in the small gaps between the print and the channel banks, and you used a slightly thicker peg for the right-hand one because the soil there was looser, more sandy, and needed the extra grip. Your fingers were now coated with a fine layer of damp peat that made them dark and cool, and the smell of horsehair mingled with the smell of the earth so that you could not tell which was which. You knelt a little longer at this channel, watching the way the moonlight caught the two loops and made them glow like threads of spun glass, and then you rose and walked on, the roll of pegs lighter now, the pile of nooses in your pocket dwindling with each stop. The work carried you further from the main mere curving around the western end of the pool and into a section of the fen where the reed bed was thinner and the ground was dotted with low mounds of bog, myrtle, and sweet gale. The channels here were smaller and more numerous, a network of tiny water tracks that threaded between the tussocks like the veins on a leaf, and you followed them with the methodical care of a man tracing a map that he had drawn himself long ago. At each promising crossing you stooped, set a peg, tied a noose, suspended the loop with a split reed, and moved on. Some channels you left untouched because they were too open, too exposed to the sky, and a bird coming in from above would see the snare too easily. Others you rejected because the mud was too soft and the peg would not hold, or because a waterfowl had recently passed through and its scent would make the wildfowl wary. You made these decisions without conscious reasoning, your eye taking in the channel and your hand either reaching for a peg or not reaching, a process that was as automatic as breathing. A little owl called from somewhere deep in the reeds, a short, sharp note that repeated 3 times and then stopped. And you lifted your head for a moment to listen, your hands pausing in midair with a peg and noose held between your fingers. The owl did not call again. You bent back to your work. By the time you had worked your way halfway around the mere, the moon had travelled a handspan across the sky, and the shadows had shifted their angle, the long black lines of the reed stems now pointing toward the water instead of away from it. Your knees were damp and cold, the wool of your breeches dark with moisture where you had knelt on the wet ground, and your fingers had taken on a faint smell of horse and damp soil that you could not have washed off even if you had wanted to. You paused and stood upright, stretching your back by leaning slightly to one side and then the other, and you looked up at the moon to gauge the time. Its position told you that an hour had passed since you left the main net, perhaps a little more, and that you still had 2 or 3 hours before the main flight of ducks would arrive. There was no hurry. There was never any hurry. You reached into your satchel and took out the water bottle, pulling the wooden stopper with your teeth and taking a short drink that tasted of the leather it had been stored in, and then you stoppered it again and put it away. You did not eat yet. You would eat later, after the snares were set. You turned and looked back along the path you had just worked, and you could see the line of your footprints in the dew-wet grass, a dark track that wound along the margin and vanished into the reeds. Somewhere in the distance, a mallard gave a single, low quack, half asleep, and then was silent. You continued. The next series of channels cut through a patch of sea-club rush whose round stems were as thick as pencils, their tops tufted with brown flower heads that nodded in the moonlight. The ground here was a little higher, the peat mixed with sand and tiny fragments of freshwater mussel shell that crunched under your boots like something much larger being ground down by time. You set a snare at the mouth of a channel where the club rush opened into a small sandy bay, positioning the peg behind a clump of rushes so that it would be invisible from the water, and you used 2 split reeds this time because the loop was a little wider and needed extra support against the breeze. The noose hung perfectly, its oval centered in the gap, and you could already imagine a teal stepping through it, with a quick nervous step, the loop tightening around its leg without pain or struggle. You did not dwell on the image. It was simply part of the work, the next stage that would follow when the birds arrived. You straightened and moved on. At a place where 3 channels converged in a damp hollow that was lush with water, forget-me-not. Though the flowers were closed and grey in the moonlight, you set a cluster of 5 snares, each one facing a different approach so that no matter from which direction a bird wandered into the hollow, it would step through one of the loops. The pegs you placed in a rough semicircle, each one driven to the same depth, and the nooses you adjusted to hover at slightly different heights, accounting for the uneven ground. The hollow smelled sweetly of wet mint and something else, something like cucumber, which was the scent of the forget-me-not leaves when crushed, and you stayed there a little longer than you needed to, breathing in the cool, fragrant air that lay pooled in the dip like the water that would gather there in winter. The fen at night was full of these small pockets of different air, each one its own climate, its own small room in the open vastness, and walking through them was like moving through a house with no walls, just floors of peat and ceilings of stars. You passed from the mint-scented hollow into a stretch of dry, rustling sedge, and then into a zone where the ditches whitened and the water smelled of iron, and then back again to the familiar, clean scent of open fen. You set the last of the snares along a narrow channel that ran parallel to the main mere, so close that you could see the moonlight on the water through a thin screen of reeds. Here the channel was heavily used, its mud bottom packed smooth and imprinted with the tracks of many different birds, the 3-toed prints of Wigan, the smaller delicate prints of teal, the wide paddling marks of a mallard, all overlapping in a palimpsest of feeding and wandering. A small pile of grit, tiny stones and crushed shell had been deposited by the retreating floodwater of the previous spring, and the birds had been visiting it regularly to fill their crops with the rough material they needed to grind their food. You set the final 3 snares at the approaches to this grit pile, spacing them carefully so that a bird approaching from any side would encounter a loop, and used the last of your split reeds to hold them at exactly the right height. The final peg went into the soil with a soft crunch. The final knot was drawn tight with that small dry squeak, and you sat back on your heels and looked at the arrangement with a calm satisfaction that was more a lack of dissatisfaction, a simple recognition that the work was done. You counted the snares as you walked back along the margin, retracing your steps past the channels and the hollows and the sandy bays. You had set 46 in all, each one a silent duplicate of the last, and they covered the approaches to the mere like a fine net stretched across the landscape, invisible and patient. Your hands were stained dark and smelled deeply of horsehair and peat, a smell that would linger on your skin through the next day and into the one after that. Your knees were damp, and the hem of your coat was wet where it had trailed in the dewy grass. You found the clearing where the main net was waiting, and you walked over to it to check the tripcord and the stakes one more time, finding everything exactly as you had left it. The net still hidden among the bent reeds, the cord still coiled neatly beside the iron ring. All was ready. All was still. You walked back to the tussock that would be your waiting place, the same one where you had sat earlier with your back against the alder sapling. The tussock was just large enough to hold you, a cushion of dense grass and moss that had been shaped by the weight of your body over many nights, and you settled onto it with a low sigh that was not weariness, but the simple release of air from lungs that had been working gently all evening. You leaned your back against the sapling, feeling the cool, smooth bark through your coat, and you stretched your legs out in front of you, crossing them at the ankles. The great net lay at your right hand, its tripcord curled in the grass. To your left, the open water of the mere stretched away into the moonlight, smooth and empty, and waiting. Beyond it, in every direction, the silent fen spread to a horizon that was already dissolving into luminous mist, the far reed beds blurring into a soft grey haze that was neither land nor sky, but something in between. The moon was now high and white and small, a silver coin tacked to the dome of the heavens, and the stars around it were so many and so bright that the darkness between them seemed almost blue. A very faint breeze, barely a breath, stirred the reed tops and then died, and the water of the mere shivered once and fell still. You folded your hands in your lap and let your head rest against the sapling, and you waited, not for anything in particular, just waited, as the night turned slowly around its silent axis. Now came the long, motionless interval that is at the heart of the fowler's trade, a stretch of time that cannot be hurried or subdivided into anything other than itself. You sat with the coat collar turned up, your hands tucked into the opposite sleeves, and your breathing settled into a pace so slow that the mist of it barely left your lips. The moon travelled imperceptibly across the heavens, cutting a path through a field of stars so thick and fine they looked like flour spilled on dark slate. On the water before you, the reflection of that moon wavered only when a light puff of air wrinkled the surface, the wrinkles travelling a few yards and then dying out, leaving the mere as smooth as black glass again. Your ears became so accustomed to the quiet that every small sound registered distinctly: the minute plop of a water drop falling from a raised reed blade, the minute screech of a mouse somewhere in the tangle of roots, the mechanical churring of a distant nightjar like a tiny wooden wheel spinning. You let your mind drift through the practical details of what was to come without gripping them tightly, imagining the way the ducks would circle, the moment you would pull the cord, the feel of a bird's weight in your hand. But these thoughts slid away into a general drowsy calm that seemed to match the fen's own mood. A slow rhythm of coziness established itself, not sleep, but the edge of sleep, the same half-dreaming that the reeds themselves must feel when they close their flower heads and droop a little lower under the high moon. Time passed not in minutes, but in shifting degrees of light and shadow, until at last a very faint sound far out across the meres to the east set your attention gently alert again, a thin, high, many-voiced sound, no louder than a breeze that you knew well. The first hour of the wait dissolved without any marker other than the steady climb of the moon to its zenith, a slow arc that you followed with your eyes every time you looked up from the water. You were not impatient, because impatience had no purchase on a night such as this, a night of such complete stillness that any desire for speed would have seemed absurd. Like wishing a stone to roll uphill, your body settled into the tussock, the grass and moss compressing slowly under your weight, and the bark of the alder sapling pressed a familiar pattern into your spine through the fustian coat. Your hands, resting inside the opposite cuffs, were warm and dry now after the earlier cold of the water, and you could feel the faint beat of your pulse in your fingertips, a rhythm as slow as the ticking of a very old clock. The great net to your right lay dark and silent, its mesh occasionally catching a slant of moon when a puff of air lifted the nearest edge, showing a brief sparkle of dew before it settled again. The tripcord curled in the grass exactly where you had left it, its hemp fibers slightly stiff with the cold, and you glanced at it sometimes without moving your head, just checking that the coil was still neat and free. Sounds came and went in the fen, like visitors who looked in at a window and then retreated. A snipe drummed somewhere far off, a sound made by air rushing through its tail feathers, a bleating tremolo that lasted 4 seconds and then snapped off, leaving a hole in the silence that the general hum of the marsh quickly filled. Later a washer rail called from a reed bed to the south, a sound like a young pig squealing, sharp and repetitive and then suddenly cut short as if the bird had been swallowed by the mud. You heard these calls and acknowledged them without stirring, your mind filing them away as information about the night's progress. The snipe meant the wind was still calm, the water rail meant the reed bed was undisturbed, and the long silences between them meant that no fox or stoat was hunting nearby. The information was a background hum, something your brain processed while your conscious thoughts wandered elsewhere, drifting through memories of other nights on other meres, the faces of other poulterers, the taste of bread and cheese eaten at dawn, the pattern of frost on a winter net. None of these thoughts were sharp or urgent. They were just the idle movements of a mind at rest, like the way a sleeping dog sometimes paddles its paws. The mist that had been rising earlier from the ditches now began to creep a little higher, forming a shallow sea of pale vapour that covered the lowest ground and left the tussocks and reed tops floating above it. Your tussock was just high enough to sit above this mist, so that you seemed to be perched on an island in a silent white lake that reflected the moonlight with a soft pearly glow. The mist moved very gently, not flowing but shifting, and it made the fen look like a landscape from an old story, a place where anything might happen or nothing at all. A heron, disturbed from its roost by some small animal passing beneath, rose up from a distant stand of reeds with a single hoarse croak and flew low over the mist with slow, heavy wing beats, its shape a dark angular cross against the moon-bright vapor. You watched it pass without turning your head, your eyes tracking it until it dropped back into the reeds on the far side of the mere, and then the mist closed over the place where it had been, and there was no sign that it had ever moved. The croak of the heron echoed once in your ears, and then was gone, replaced by the immense soft hush of the night. Your mind drifted to the cottage you had left hours ago, the way the fire had been banking down, the single candle you had snuffed with a damp finger. You saw the cottage in your memory as a low, dark shape, with a thin whisper of white smoke still drifting from the chimney, the door closed, the window dark, the rain barrel glimmering faintly at the corner. That image was comforting, a fixed point at the edge of the vast fen, and you held it for a moment without dwelling on it, letting it fade naturally into the background of other thoughts. You thought about the London poulterers, the men who would buy these birds and take them to Leadenhall Market, and you pictured the market in the early morning, the wooden stalls being set up, the voices of the merchants echoing on cobbles you had never walked. The picture was vague and incomplete, built from things you had been told rather than things you had seen, and it dissolved almost at once into the present reality of the mere and the moon and the mist. You did not feel any connection to that faraway city, nor any distance from it. It was simply another part of the same world, a world that turned quietly without requiring your attention. A moth fluttered past your face, its wings a pale blur, and it circled your head once before disappearing toward the water. You watched it go, a tiny scrap of life navigating the enormous night. And then you returned your gaze to the sky. The constellation of the Plough had rotated a little further around the pole star, its handle now pointing more to the east than the north, and a new star had risen above the horizon, a bright one that flickered orange and then white and then orange again as it climbed through the thicker air near the ground. You had seen that star rise on many nights from this same spot, and you knew without naming it that it was not a star at all, but a planet, the same one that had been flaring in the west earlier and was now climbing to join the moon. The moon itself was ever so slightly past its zenith, beginning its long, slow descent toward the western reed beds, and the angle of its light had shifted just enough that the shadows of the reeds were now a little longer, a little more slanted than they had been an hour before. Time was passing. It was passing so gently that it felt more like a color changing than a movement, a gradual transition from deep silver to pale silver to something that would eventually be grey. You allowed yourself to close your eyes for a span, not to sleep, but to rest them from the brightness of the moon on water, and the darkness behind your lids was a deep, warm red-brown that pulsed faintly with your heartbeat. With your eyes closed, the sounds of the fen became sharper and more distinct. The tiny lapping of water against a submerged reed stem, the distant murmur of a running ditch, the very faint hiss of the mist condensing on the grass blades around your feet. You could smell the fen more clearly too, the peat and the mint and the cold, clean water, and under those a hint of something flowering, perhaps the last of the meadow rue, its scent sweet and thin and fading. You listened and smelled and felt the cool air on your cheeks, and you were aware of your own breathing, slow and deep and even, the air entering your nose and traveling down and then coming back up and out like a tide washing over a flat beach. The moment was complete in itself, without need of anything before or after, and you rested in it the way a boat rests in still water, held by nothing but its own buoyancy. When you opened your eyes again, you did so without start, simply lifting your lids the way a curtain is drawn back on a window that has always been there. The mere was unchanged, the water still dark and silver, the reed beds still a dark wall, the mist still a soft white sea, the moon still a bright disk, now a little lower, a little smaller. But something had shifted in the quality of the night, a change so subtle you felt it before you recognized it. The silence was no longer an empty silence, but a waiting silence the kind of stillness that comes just before something arrives. You knew this feeling well. It was the fen telling you without words or signs that the wildfowl were on their way. You did not move or tense or hold your breath. You simply noted the change and remained as you were, your body still relaxed against the sapling, your hands still tucked into your sleeves, your eyes still open and calm. The picture of the night was the same as it had been, but somewhere far beyond the horizon, the birds were rising from their daytime resting grounds, stretching their wings, calling to one another in soft conversational notes, and beginning the long flight that would bring them to your mere. You turned your head very slowly to look at the eastern sky, the direction from which the ducks would come if they followed their usual route. The sky there was still dark, the stars still bright, but the faintest pale line was beginning to show just above the reed tops. Not dawn, but the early breath of dawn, a lightning so subtle that it might have been imagination. It would be several hours yet before the sun actually rose, but the sky was beginning its slow preparation, and the ducks, sensitive to such things, would be moving ahead of it. You watched that pale line for a while, noting how it stayed pale without brightening, a promise that was not yet being kept, and then you turned your head back to the mirror. Your right hand, the one you would use to pull the tripcord, you withdrew from your sleeve and laid on your thigh, palm up, fingers slightly curled, ready but not tense. The hemp of the cord was an arm's length away, and when the time came you would reach for it without having to look, your hand knowing exactly where it lay. Another bird called in the distance, not a water rail this time, but a duck, its voice unmistakable, a low musical wee-oo that repeated twice and then fell silent. It was a widgeon, and it was still far away, probably on a neighboring mere, but its call was a sign that the birds were stirring. You listened carefully, and after a moment you heard another widgeon answer from even further off, and then a third, the calls drifting across the fen like notes of a song being sung in different rooms of a huge house. The sound was not loud, it was barely louder than the rustle of the reeds, but it carried clearly through the still night air, and it told you that the first flocks were already in the air, wheeling and calling and beginning to make their way toward the larger water where they would spend the dark hours before dawn. You did not stand or crouch or make any movement that might startle a bird that was still miles away. You simply remained seated, your hand on your thigh, your breathing slow, your eyes on the eastern sky where the faint pale line remained steady and unchanging. The waiting, which had been a quiet, dreamy interval, now became something only slightly more alert, like the difference between a boat drifting and a boat whose anchor has just been lifted. You were still patient, still unhurried, but your attention had gathered itself into a soft focus, a readiness that was the opposite of tension. The fen around you seemed to share this focus. The mist had stopped rising and lay still. The breeze had died entirely, and the only movement in the whole world was the slow descent of the moon and the thin, high call of the widgeon growing gradually, very gradually, closer. You settled deeper into the tussock, feeling the grass and moss give a little more, and you let your eyes rest on the dark water where the net lay hidden. The moon had dropped enough now that the reflection was no longer a perfect disk, but a slightly stretched oval, its edges soft and trembling, and it seemed to pulse faintly with a light that came from within the water rather than from the sky. The night had entered its deep middle, the time when the wildfowl would come, and you were ready, not in the sense of being prepared to act, but in the sense of being wholly present, a part of the fen, a part of the waiting, a part of the moon and the water and the reeds. The sound grew from a whisper to a soft but definite whistling, an interweaving of many wings and low conversational calls that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. You watched the eastern sky where a dark smudge began to separate itself from the general darkness, resolving into the shapes of wildfowl flying in a loose, undulating line that stretched and contracted like a ribbon of smoke. They were widgeon, you could tell by the rounded heads and the quickness of their wing beats, and they came in a half-dozen small flocks that merged and divided and merged again, scanning the ground below them with that extraordinary sight that sees color and pattern in what to a human is only shadow. The first flock circled the mere 3 times, dropping lower with each pass, the birds' white underparts now catching the moon so that they flashed like signal mirrors, and you held yourself utterly still, not even turning your head, your eyes half-lidded to conceal any wet gleam. Then the leaders cupped their wings and tilted downwards, splashing one by one into the center of the pool with soft splashes and gurgles, and in a moment the water was dotted with perhaps 60 or 70 ducks, some already upending to dabble, others preening their breast feathers with quick nervous movements of the bill. Their calls were not loud, a low musical wheew that repeated in a contented pattern, and the sound mingled with the plash of water and the rustle of reeds swayed by their passage. More birds arrived over the next half hour, a handful of teal dropping in like falling leaves near the reed edge to your left, and a solitary mallard that planed in from the north and settled on the far side with a dignified ripple. You slowly, almost without volition, turned your gaze toward the main net, judging distances, watching the ducks paddle nearer to the crescent of hidden mesh without the least alarm, their calm making your own heart beat so slowly that it seemed to match the steady lap of water against peat. The first sound you had heard was not the birds themselves, but the effect of the birds on the air, a change in the texture of the silence that was so subtle you might have missed it if your ears had not been tuned to such things for decades. The high, thin whistling started as a thread of sound so fine it could have been the wind, though no wind was blowing, and it grew slowly, taking its time, as though the ducks were as unhurried as you were. The eastern sky, where the faint line of pre-dawn had been hiding, now showed the dark specks of the leading flock, tiny moving commas that rose and fell on invisible currents, their formation a fluid thing that pulsed like a starlight murmur. You watched them come without raising your chin from where it rested against your coat collar, your eyes tracking the flock as a whole rather than any individual bird, seeing the way the group moved like a single organism with many wings, a living sheet that rippled across the stars and then folded itself into a narrower band as the ducks began to descend toward the mere. The circling of the mere was a ritual the Witchen performed every night, a careful inspection of the water below that combined caution with the knowledge that this pool had been safe for generations. They flew around the perimeter 3 times, not in tight circles but in a wide spiral that took them over the reed beds and back out over the marshes, each pass a little lower, each pass a little slower. On the first circuit they were high enough that their bodies were silhouettes against the brighter patch of sky where the moon hung, their wings beating with a steady flickering rhythm that made them look like a moving frieze cut from black paper. On the second circuit they were low enough that you could see the pale bellies of the drakes and the slightly duller breasts of the hens, and you could hear the individual wing beats now, a soft whirring that was not one sound, but a chorus of sounds, each bird contributing its own small noise to the whole. On the third circuit they were so low that the water shivered under the pressure of their passage, and you held your breath without thinking, not from tension, but from a kind of reverence for the moment, a sense that this was the part of the night that mattered, the quiet climax toward which everything had been building. When the first birds dropped their feet and cupped their wings, the movement was so natural and so smooth that it seemed the air itself was gently placing them on the water. They touched down with a soft splash that was more like a kiss than a disturbance, the water parting around their bellies and then closing again in small spreading rings that intersected and danced. The first duck to land was a drake, its chestnut head and creamy crown stripe clearly visible in the moonlight, and it settled its wings with a few quick flaps and then began to paddle in a small circle, turning around as though to orient itself. Within seconds another drake landed beside it, then a hen, then 3 more together, their splashes overlapping until the water was alive with the sound of settling birds. The center of the mere, which had been a dark and empty sheet, now became a busy common of 60 or 70 ducks, their bodies dark on the silver water, their heads turning this way and that, their soft conversational calls passing back and forth like pleasantries exchanged between neighbors who had not seen one another since the previous night. Some of the ducks immediately upended, their tails pointing skyward and their heads plunging below the surface to dabble in the soft mud for the tender shoots of water plantain and the tiny freshwater snails that clung to the submerged stems. Their bodies, half visible through the clear water, looked like pale fish swimming upside down, and their feet paddled slowly to keep them in position while they fed. Others began to preen, turning their heads on their long, flexible necks to run their bills through their wing feathers, smoothing and aligning the barbs, occasionally shaking themselves with a rapid fluttering motion that sent a spray of droplets glittering into the moonlight. A few of the birds simply rested, tucking their bills under their wing coverts and floating in silence, their bodies rising and falling almost imperceptibly on the gentle pulse of the mere. The whole scene was one of complete and utter peace, a domestic tranquility that had been enacted on this same water on 1,000 nights before, and would be enacted on 1,000 nights to come. You watched all of this from your tussock, your body as still as the older sapling behind you, your breathing so shallow that it did not disturb the collar of your coat. The mist that had been lying in the low places had retreated slightly, as if making room for the ducks, and the water between you and the birds was a clear field of silver under the moon. The widgeon nearest the net were perhaps 15 yards away, paddling slowly, sometimes pausing to dip their bills into the water and then raising them again with a quick swallowing motion. They had no awareness of the net, no sense that the reeds at the water's edge held anything other than the same reeds they had seen on every other visit. You had done your work well, and the night was doing the rest, the darkness and the water and the habits of the wildfowl all combining to bring the birds gently, inevitably, toward the crescent of hidden mesh. A handful of teal arrived while you watched, dropping in like falling leaves near the reed edge to your left, their small bodies so light that they barely made a splash. Teal were the smallest of the ducks that visited the mere, quick and agile, and they settled on the water with a nervous energy that was quite different from the calm of the widgeon. They swam in tight little groups, their heads turning rapidly, their bodies low in the water, and they kept close to the reeds where they could vanish in an instant if danger appeared. Their calls were high and piping, a sort of musical chatter that was too soft to be heard at any distance, and you watched them without moving your head, observing how they nosed among the floating duckweed and picked at invisible morsels with their fine dark bills. One of them swam within a yard of the hidden net, its foot actually brushing against a submerged guide cord, and it paused for a moment as if sensing some tiny anomaly, then continued on its way, the moment passing without consequence. The solitary mallard came later, planing in from the north with its wings set in a shallow V, its body much larger and heavier than the widgeon or teal. It landed near the far bank with a splash that was almost a crash, a dignified but slightly awkward arrival that sent a wave rolling outward in a perfect circle. The mallard settled itself with a few shakes of its tail, and then began to paddle slowly across the mere, its green head glinting with an iridescence that was visible even in the monochrome moonlight. It did not join the widgeon but kept to its own company, paddling a stately course along the far reed line, occasionally dipping its bill into the water with a calm authority. You watched it with a mild interest that did not rise to the level of thought, simply noting its presence as part of the general pattern of the night, another thread in the fabric of the mere. The calls of the ducks, which had been frequent during the first minutes after their arrival, now began to subside into a lower and more continuous murmur, the sound of birds that had accepted the water as safe and were settling into their feeding and resting. The wee-oo of the widgeon became intermittent, the piping of the teal faded to occasional single notes, and the mallard said nothing at all. The only sounds were the soft plash of water as birds shifted position, the rustle of feathers being preened, and the gentle gurgle of an upended duck disturbing the surface. These sounds were so soft and so continuous that they became a kind of silence themselves, a living background that was no more intrusive than the sound of your own breathing. Your heart, which had been beating slowly all night, now seemed to beat even slower, its rhythm settling into a pace that matched the slow paddle of a duck across still water, a rhythm of complete and absolute rest. The moon had now descended far enough that its light came from a slightly different angle, casting the shadows of the reeds at a new slant and making the water look deeper, darker, richer. The reflection of the moon was no longer a disk, but a long column of silver that stretched from the center of the mere almost to your feet, a path of light that any bird could swim along if it chose. The widgeon, which had been loosely scattered across the center of the pool, were now beginning to drift slowly toward the shallower water near the reeds, following the natural inclination that brought them to the feeding grounds in the early hours of darkness. Some of them were already within the curve of the net, their bodies moving among the bent reeds that held the mesh, completely unaware that they were inside the trap. You could see them clearly, their shapes dark against the moonlit water, their movements relaxed and natural, their calls soft and occasional. The net itself was still invisible, a ghost in the reeds, waiting for the moment when you would choose to pull the cord. You did not pull the cord. You sat and watched, your right hand resting on your thigh exactly where you had placed it, your fingers loose and warm. There was no need to hurry because the ducks were not going anywhere. They would feed and preen and rest in the same spot for hours, until the first real light of dawn began to show in the east, and they would rise and fly back to their daytime grounds. The night was still deep, the moon still bright, the mist still low, and you had all the time in the world. The flock of teal had merged with the widgeon at the near edge of the mere, the two species mingling without any sign of conflict, and together they formed a loose congregation of perhaps 80 or 90 birds, a floating assembly that was as peaceful as a painting. A second mallard arrived from somewhere to the west, its quack a single low note that was answered by the first mallard from the far side, and the two of them paddled toward each other with slow deliberation, meeting near the center of the pool and then drifting apart again. Their greeting complete, you let your gaze travel slowly across the entire scene, taking in the ducks, the water, the reeds, the moon, the mist, the stars, all of it a single living picture that was held in a perfect quiet balance. The net was ready, the snares were ready, 46 of them lying along the channels and hollows around the mere, their gossamer loops open and waiting. The night was half over, or perhaps more than half, but you felt no weariness, only a deep calm that was the product of stillness and patience, and the complete absence of any need to be anywhere other than where you were. The ducks paddled and fed and preened, and you watched them with the same slow attention that you would give to a fire burning down in a hearth, a process that was both active and passive, a doing that was mostly a being. Somewhere far to the east, the sky was still dark, but the faint line of pre-dawn had not brightened. It held steady as a promise that was not yet being kept, giving you the hours you needed and the silence you cherished. A silence that was now filled with the soft, living sounds of wildfowl at rest on the water. A group of widgeon, perhaps 8 or 9 of them, had ambled their way into the shallow curve of the pool, cupped by your net, and they were so close that you could see the soft buff color of their crown stripes and the neat white edges of the wing coverts folded on their backs. They moved with a gentle paddling that stirred the water into small swirls of silver, their heads dipping occasionally to sip at the surface, their low wee-oo calls passing back and forth like murmurs exchanged in a half-sleep. The net lay invisible beneath them, the mesh suspended a few inches under the water, the cork floats riding just above the surface behind a screen of bent reeds. You had been watching their drift for some time, noting how they circled and returned, how they settled deeper into the curve with each passing minute, how their movements grew slower and more contented as the night wore on. The moment had arrived without announcing itself, the way a tide turns, and you understood this not as a decision, but as a simple recognition, the same way you knew when to lift a kettle from the fire, or when to turn for home at the end of a long walk. Your right hand closed around the tripcord, the hemp rough against your curled fingers, and you drew in a single slow breath through your nose, not with excitement, but with the same unhurried deliberation you would use to lift a cup of water to your lips. The night held still around you, the moon steady, the mist motionless, the ducks calm and unaware, and in that pocket of perfect quiet you pulled the cord with a smooth, even motion that ran through the iron ring with a clean hiss. The far end of the net lifted from the water with a soft cascade of droplets that shone in the moonlight like a curtain of tiny glass beads, and then it fell forward over the birds in a whispering sweep, the mesh descending with a rustle that was barely louder than the sound of reeds stirring in a breeze. The ducks rose in a brief flurry of splashing and wing thumping, their bodies surging upward against the falling net, and then the mesh settled over them, and their movement subsided almost at once into a muffled flapping that was more surprise than struggle, a soft percussive rustling that lasted only a few heartbeats before fading into a quiet, intermittent trembling. The net now lay draped across that section of the pool like a dark blanket, its edges floating on the water, its center weighed down by the stones, and beneath it the trapped birds were visible as a cluster of rounded shapes that shifted gently, their outlines blurred by the mesh. You rose from the tussock slowly, your knee joints giving a soft crack that the fen absorbed without echo, and you stepped down to the waterline with the care of a man walking on slick stones, placing each foot flat on the submerged peat to avoid a splash. The cold water welled up around your boots again, familiar and bracing, and you waded toward the net with your hands held low, your movements fluid and unhurried, the water parting around your legs with a soft gurgle that was the only sound you made. Reaching the edge of the net, you stopped and surveyed the arrangement with a quick sweep of your eyes, noting where the lead cord had fallen, where the mesh had snagged on a reed stem, where the trapped birds were clustered. Everything was as it should be. The net had performed its work exactly as designed, and now came the quiet, careful business of gathering it in. You bent low over the water and began to collect the edges of the net inward, lifting the lead cord with one hand while the other gathered the mesh in loose folds, working your way around the curve with a slow, methodical pace. The trapped ducks, feeling the net close around them, made small movements that sent shivers through the hemp, but they did not thrash or cry out. Wildfowl in the hand are often stiller than those on the water, their instinct for stillness taking over when flight is not possible. You murmured to them as you worked, not words exactly, but a low hum of breath that was more a vibration than a sound, a tone you had used with animals since childhood, and the birds seemed to listen, their movements growing quieter under the steady reassurance of your voice. When the net had been gathered into a loose bag of hemp with the ducks held gently inside, you waded back to the tussock and lifted the bundle onto the grass, water streaming from the mesh in a dozen thin rivulets that darkened the dry blades. You knelt beside the bundle, the damp wool of your breeches pressing cold against your knees, and you opened the mouth of the net wide enough to reach inside. One by one you drew out a duck, your hands sliding through the mesh with a practiced gentleness, your fingers closing around the bird's body with a grip that was firm but without pressure, the same grip you would use to hold a hen's egg without breaking it. The first bird was a drake wigeon, its chestnut head and creamy crown gleaming in the moonlight, its dark eye watching you with a calm that was not trust but the absence of fear, a wild creature's acceptance of the moment as it was. You smoothed its wings against its body with one thumb, checking that the feathers lay flat and the neck was straight, and then you placed it into the canvas game bag with a quiet word that was half a whisper. The bird settled into the bag with a soft rustle and a blink, and you reached into the net for the next one. The process repeated itself with a rhythm that was as steady and calming as everything else you had done that night. Reach into the net, feel for the warm body beneath the damp feathers, cup the bird in both hands, lift it clear of the mesh, smooth the wings, check the neck, place it in the bag, murmur a word, reach again. The ducks varied slightly in size and color, some drakes and some hens, some with the full bright plumage of the season and others with the duller feathers of younger birds, but your hands made no distinction between them, treating each one with the same patient care. The wigeon was soft and plump, their breast feathers dense and warm, and they smelled faintly of the marsh water they had been dabbling in, a clean green scent like wet grass. The teal, which had been caught along with the wigeon in the curve of the net, were smaller and quicker, their bodies compact and muscular, their dark bills tiny and fine. You drew out 3 teal in succession, each one fitting easily into the palm of your hand, and you placed them into the bag with the others, where they made small adjusting movements and then settled into stillness. The canvas bag grew heavier by slow degrees, the living weight of the birds pressing against your thigh as you knelt beside it, and you could feel the bag shift occasionally as a bird inside changed position, a soft, benign movement that was as reassuring as the purr of a cat. When the net was empty, you checked it carefully, running your hands through the mesh to be certain no bird remained tangled in a fold, and you found none. The capture had been clean and complete. You spread the net out on the grass to dry slightly, though it would be wet again from the dew before you packed it, and you tied the mouth of the game bag with a length of spun cord, drawing the knot tight with a soft rasp of hemp against canvas. The bag now held 13 birds, a good catch from the main net, and they had settled into a quiet communal warmth, their bodies pressed together in the dark interior of the canvas, their breathing slow and even. You rested your hand on the bag for a moment, feeling the faint rise and fall of the birds within, and then you rose to your feet and turned toward the snare lines that you had set along the drier margin of the mere. The walk to the snares was short, only a dozen paces across the dew-wet grass, and the moonlight was still bright enough to show every detail of the ground. You carried the canvas roll of spare pegs under one arm, though you would not need them, and you walked with the steady stooped gait of a man who'd been on his feet all night, your body tired in a way that was comfortable rather than draining. The first channel, the one with the hoofprint of the roe deer pressed into the mud, came into view as a ribbon of silver grey that twisted through the darker reed stems, and you stopped at its edge to examine the snare you had set there. The horsehair loop was no longer suspended in its split reed support. It was drawn tight around the leg of a widgeon that sat in the grass beside the channel, its body still and calm, its bright eye watching your approach without alarm. The bird had stepped through the noose and felt it close, and then it had simply stopped walking as wildfowl do, waiting for whatever came next with a patience that matched your own. You knelt beside it, murmuring the same low hum of breath, and you loosened the noose with a deft pinch of thumb and forefinger, the horsehair slipping free without resistance. The bird's leg was unharmed, the fine scales of the skin unbroken, and you smoothed the feathers gently before placing it into a second smaller game bag that you had brought specifically for the snare-caught birds. It settled with a soft, throaty sound and tucked its bill under its wing, as though the whole experience had been nothing more than a brief interruption of its night. You moved to the next channel and found another widgeon, this one a hen with softer brown plumage, caught in the same calm manner, the noose around its leg, and the bird sitting quietly in a tuft of marsh grass. Again you loosened the horsehair with a pinch. Again you smoothed the feathers and checked the leg. Again you placed the bird in the bag with a murmur. The process repeated at the next channel and the next, a quiet harvest that was more like gathering eggs from a henhouse than taking wild creatures from a marsh. 3 more widgeon, 2 teal, and a single mallard drake that waited near the grit pile with a dignified stillness, its green head glinting in the moonlight as you bent to free it. The mallard was heavier than the others, its body solid and muscular, and it watched you with a calm golden eye that seemed to hold a great deal of ancient knowledge, the eye of a bird that had flown 1,000 miles and would fly 1,000 more. You held it for a moment longer than the others, feeling the strong beat of its heart through the feathers, and then you placed it in the bag with a rest. You walked the entire line of snares, crossing from channel to channel, kneeling and rising and kneeling again. And by the time you had finished, you had collected 7 more birds from the horsehair loops, all of them taken cleanly and without injury, all of them now resting in the smaller game bag that hung at your side. 3 of the snares were empty, their loops still open and waiting, and you left them in place in case a late arriving bird should wander through before dawn. The other snares you collected one by one, pulling the pegs from the peat with a steady tug that left a small dark hole which the groundwater slowly filled, and you wound each horsehair noose around your thumb into a tiny neat coil before dropping it into the snare's pouch. The pegs you wiped on your coat to remove the worst of the mud, and then you stacked them in the canvas roll and tied it shut with a bit of cord. The process of collecting the gear took less time than setting it had done, because collecting was a simpler task, a matter of undoing what had been done, and your hands moved through it with an ease that required no thought at all. With the snares gathered and the birds bagged, you walked back to the tussock where the main net still lay spread on the grass. You knelt beside it and poured a little water from your leather bottle over your hands, rinsing away the fine layer of peat and horsehair that had accumulated on your skin, drying them on the skirt of your coat. Then you sat back on your heels and looked out at the mere, now empty of ducks, the water smooth and dark under the descending moon. The night's work was done, or nearly done, and a quiet sense of completion settled over you like a second coat, warm and comfortable. You would pack the net, shoulder the bags, and begin the long walk back toward the cottage and the London poulterers. But you did not hurry. The moon had shifted only a handspan westward since you had pulled the cord, and the night was still deep, still quiet, still yours. Back on the tussock, you opened the mouth of the game bag wide and let the moonlight fall across the birds inside, their feathers a soft mosaic of browns and greys and the pale buff of widgeon crowns. You counted them with no particular pride, merely the quiet accounting of a man tallying his work, your lips moving slightly as your forefinger touched each bird in turn. There were 16 birds in the main bag and 7 in the smaller snare bag, making 23 in all, a mixed company of widgeon, teal, and the lone mallard drake that lay near the bottom with its green head tucked under a wing. The count was neither good nor bad. It was simply the number the night had given you, and you received it without comment, the way you would receive the weight of a sack of grain or the measure of water in a rain barrel. 23 birds, each one warm and calm and whole, their feathers mostly unruffled despite the brief surprise of the net, their breathing slow and even in the close dark of the canvas. You passed a gentle hand over each one to check that the wings lay flat and the necks were straight, a final inspection that was more habit than necessity. The widgeon hens were slightly smaller than the drakes, their plumage a soft mottled brown that blended easily with the shadows of the bag, and they blinked up at you with the same calm dark eyes as their mates. The teal were tiny and compact, their bodies fitting easily into the cup of your palm, and you counted 4 of them among the catch, each one a neat bundle of grey and chestnut feathers. The mallard drake you lifted out briefly to examine, turning it gently in your hands, feeling the solid muscle of its breast and the perfect unbroken sheen of its wing coverts. It was a bird that would fetch a good price at Leadenhall Market, though you gave the thought no more weight than you gave the mallard itself, which was simply the weight of a duck in your hands. You placed it back in the bag, and it resettled itself with a small shake of its tail, the movement barely visible in the dim canvas interior. From your satchel you drew out the larger canvas sacks that were lined with clean straw, the straw pale and dry and smelling of the previous summer's hay harvest. You shook out each sack to loosen the straw, fluffing it between your fingers so that it would cushion the birds without matting, and then you laid the sacks open on the grass beside the tussock. The transfer of birds from the game bags to the transport sacks was a slow, careful process that you performed kneeling, one bird at a time, your hands moving between the bags with the same steady rhythm that had governed all your work. Each bird you lifted with both hands, cradling it against your chest for a moment while you positioned the sack, and then you lowered it into the straw with a soft rustle of dry stalks. The birds accepted this second enclosure as calmly as they had accepted the first, settling into the straw with small adjusting movements, and then becoming still, their bodies warm and their eyes open and their breathing slow. The straw filled the spaces between them, holding them apart gently so that their feathers would not be crushed, and the sacks when full were soft and rounded, like sacks of down rather than of living birds. When all 23 birds had been transferred, you drew the neck of each transport sack closed with a length of spun cord, tying the knot with a particular hitch that would hold firm against any jostling but could be loosened with a single pull. You tested each knot with a tug, found them secure, and then hoisted one sack over each shoulder, feeling the weight settle in a comfortable dead pull that was familiar to your spine. The sacks together weigh perhaps 30 pounds, not heavy, but substantial, a weight that would grow gradually more noticeable over the miles of the walk home, but would never become painful. The weight was part of the work, as much a part as the nets and the snares and the waiting, and you accepted it without thought, the way a tree accepts the weight of its own branches. The canvas of the sacks was rough against your coat, and the straw inside made a soft rustling sound whenever you shifted, a sound like a mouse moving through a hayloft. With the bird secured, you turned to the main net that still lay spread on the grass, its mesh damp and sparkling with droplets of mere water. Packing the net was a task you had done so many times that your hands performed it entirely on their own, folding the mesh in even layers, stacking the cork floats together so they nested like shells, coiling the stone weights into a tight bundle that would not tangle. You worked your way from one end of the net to the other, gathering it into a compact rectangle that you then rolled into a cylinder and tied with the leather strings. The wet hemp was cold in your hands and smelled strongly of the mere but clean green scent that would linger on the net for days. When the roll was complete, you set it aside on the grass and walked back to the water's edge to pull the wooden stakes that had held the net in position. Each stake came out of the peat with a soft sucking sound, the mud releasing its grip reluctantly, and you wiped each one on the wet grass before adding it to the canvas roll with the others. The iron ring you pulled last, its metal cold and slick with water, and you tucked it into a small pocket inside your satchel where it would not rub against anything else. The snares that had not caught birds, the 3 empty loops still waiting in their channels, you collected as you had collected the others earlier, pulling the pegs and winding the horsehair nooses around your thumb. These you added to the snares pouch, and the pouch went into your coat pocket, its weight now substantially less than it had been at the start of the night. You walked a slow circuit of the area, your eyes scanning the grass and the mud for any forgotten item, any scrap of cord or split reed or dropped peg. But you found nothing. You had left the place as clean as you had found it, the only signs of your presence being a few boot prints in the soft peat that the rising groundwater would erase before noon. The mere itself looked exactly as it had when you arrived hours ago, a broad, shallow pool ringed by reeds, its surface smooth and dark under the descending moon, its water empty of ducks, its banks quiet and still. You stood for a moment at the edge of the water, looking out across it, and you felt that particular quiet satisfaction that comes from work completed, not a triumph or a pleasure, but simply a sense of rightness, the feeling of a cycle closed and a task done. You poured a little more water from your leather bottle over your hands, rinsing away the last traces of mud and horsehair, and you dried your hands on the skirt of your coat before reaching into the satchel for the barley bread and the lump of hard cheese. Eating was part of the ritual, a small pause between the work and the walk home, and you did it standing up, facing the water, chewing slowly, with the steady rhythm of a man who was not particularly hungry, but knew he would need the sustenance later. The bread was dense and slightly gritty, its nutty flavor a familiar comfort, and the cheese was sharp and salty, its waxed rind tough enough to leave tooth marks. You ate half the bread and a corner of the cheese, enough to settle the slight hollow in your stomach, and then you wrapped the remainder in the linen cloth and returned it to the satchel. The water in the bottle you drank in 2 long swallows, the liquid cool and tasting of leather and iron, and then you stoppered the bottle and put it away. The meal was simple, brief, and satisfying, and it marked the end of the Mears chapter in your night. Now you hoisted the transport sacks again, settling their weight across your shoulders, and you tucked the rolled net under your left arm, the satchel under your right. The gear was bulky but manageable, and you had carried it in this same configuration so many times that your body knew exactly how to balance the load, leaning slightly forward from the waist, your stride shortening to accommodate the weight. You turned away from the mere and faced the path that led back through the reeds, the same dark seam of pressed peat that had brought you here hours ago. The moon was now well past its zenith, dropping toward the western horizon with a slow inevitability that matched your own steady pace, and its light came at a low slant that made the reed shadows long and thin. The mist that had risen earlier had now begun to settle again, condensing into a heavy dew that beaded on every reed blade and grass stem, and the air had taken on that particular chill that comes in the last hours before dawn, a cold that was not bitter but clean and sharp, like the taste of a winter apple. You pulled your coat collar a little higher and set off down the path, your boots finding the familiar way without guidance, and the mere faded behind you step by step until it was only a memory of dark water and silver moonlight, and then not even a memory, just the path and the reeds and the slow weight of the birds on your back. The faintest suggestion of grey was now troubling the sky far to the east, not dawn, but the first inkling that the night had begun to age, a lightening so subtle that it was more a change in the quality of the darkness than a colour in its own right. The stars in that part of the sky had lost some of their sharpness, their edges blurring as the atmosphere shifted, and the planet that had blazed so brightly earlier was now a pale point sinking toward the horizon. The moon, still bright but now distinctly lower, had turned a soft buttery colour again, the same colour it had worn when it first rose, and it seemed larger than it had at its zenith, an optical illusion that you had seen 1,000 times and never thought to question. You walked through this changing light with the steady pace of a man who was part of the landscape, your shadow long and thin before you, your breath a faint cloud that trailed over your shoulder and vanished. The path was the same path, the reeds were the same reeds, the fen was the same fen, and you moved through it all with the quiet belonging of something that had grown there, a tree or a stone or a ditch of slow water, patient and enduring and entirely at peace. The return path felt subtly different underfoot, the peat in some places releasing a little more water as the night cooled toward its end, so that each step produced a small wet sigh that was deeper than the sound you had made walking out. The reeds seemed closer together simply because the moon had dropped so low that its light came nearly horizontally, casting long, tangled shadows ahead of you that made the narrow way feel like a tunnel through a dark forest of stems. You walked with the steady, stooped gait of a man carrying a load, your back rounded slightly under the sacks, your shoulders working in a rhythm that had become as automatic as breathing. The transport sacks rode against your shoulder blades with a soft, shifting weight, the birds inside quiet and warm, their occasional small movements transmitted through the canvas as a faint rustle that was more felt than heard. At your left side, the rolled net bumped gently against your hip with each stride, a soft, regular tap that you noticed only when it stopped and then began again after you adjusted your arm. The first section of the path took you back through the opening in the reeds, where the 3 faint tracks met, the broken wattle hurdle still leaning against the blackthorned thicket, exactly as you had left it, its woven withies silvered by the low moon. You passed it without pause, your boots choosing the right-hand track that led toward the cottage, and the reeds closed in again on either side, their tops now so heavy with dew that they drooped slightly, forming a canopy that glittered when the moonlight struck the water droplets at the correct angle. A light breeze had begun to stir, the first real movement of air since the early part of the night, and it came from the east with a coolness that carried the faint mineral smell of the distant sea, a smell that was more a freshness than a scent. The breeze pushed through the reed tops with a long sigh that travelled from one end of the fen to the other, and the reeds swayed in its wake, their stems rubbing together with a papery sound that was the signature music of the marsh. You turned your face into the breeze for a moment, letting it cool the skin around your eyes, and then you lowered your head again and walked on. The plank bridge appeared under your feet with a sudden hollow thud, its alder poles slick with dew, and you crossed it with the careful, flat-footed step of a man who had slipped on wet wood before and did not care to do so again. Below the bridge, the black cut of water was no longer black, but a deep pewter grey, the first hint of dawn having seeped into the sky enough to lighten the surface of every ditch and runnel. A watervole slipped from the bank with a tiny plop and swam across the current in a neat V-shaped wake, its round head and small round ears visible for a moment before it vanished into a hole in the opposite bank. You watched it go without stopping, your stride continuing uninterrupted, the brief sight of another living creature, a small pleasant note in the long quiet symphony of the walk. Beyond the bridge, the path rose slightly to the stretch of sandy soil where marsh orchids grew in the spring, though now the ground was bare except for the dry brown rosettes of their leaves, and you skirted a patch of bog cotton whose white heads nodded like tiny flags in the breeze. The mist that had earlier filled the low places was now thinning, retreating into the deepest ditches and hollows, and the fen was opening up again as the light grew, the far reed beds becoming visible as a dark line against a sky that was turning from indigo to a soft dove grey. Your mind, which had been so quiet during the long wait, now began to stir slightly as the walk progressed, not with thoughts of any consequence, but with the small, idle reflections that accompany a journey on foot. You thought about the fire you would light when you reached the cottage, the way the dry turfs would catch and bloom, the kettle you would hang on its hook, the warmth that would slowly fill the small room and ease the cold from your bones. You thought about the poulterer, a man named John whose father had traded with your father, and you pictured his cart waiting as it did every Tuesday and Saturday at the place where the fen track met the King's Lynn Drove road, the horse stamping and blowing steam in the chill, the cart bed stacked with empty crates that would be full by the time it turned south toward London. These thoughts were not urgent. They drifted through your mind like the mist drifting through the reeds, formless and slow and without any particular destination. You did not hold on to them or push them away, you simply let them pass, the way the fen let water pass through its ditches on its way to the sea. The walk was longer than the walk out had been, or it felt longer because you were carrying weight now and your body had been awake for many hours, but the difference was so slight that it registered only as a quiet physical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that your legs held rather than your mind. Your pace did not slow, nor did it quicken. It remained the same steady amble that had carried you from the cottage all those hours ago, a pace that was somewhere between a walk and a saunter, economical and unhurried. The birds in the sacks had settled into a complete stillness, their bodies warm against your back, and you could feel the collective heat of them through the canvas, a warmth that was surprisingly substantial, like carrying a hot water bottle wrapped in straw. That warmth was comforting, a small companionship in the vast empty fen, and you adjusted the sacks once to settle them more evenly, the canvas straps creaking softly with the movement. After a time, the path brought you to the open stretch where the old willow stump stood, its peeling bark catching the low moonlight in long pale curls, and you paused there for a brief rest, leaning your hip against the stump as you had done on the way out. The wood was cold and rough and damp, familiar as a handshake, and you stood with your head lifted, breathing deeply, feeling the cool air move in and out of your lungs. The sky directly overhead had faded from black to a deep rinsed indigo, the color of water in a deep well, and the morning star hung in the east like a drop of dew on a blade of dark blue grass, so bright and steady that it seemed to pulse. The moon was now barely above the western reed line, a pale yellow disk that had grown large again with the approach of setting, and its light was no longer silver but a soft honey color that made the fen look like a painting done on old wood. You remained there for a minute or two, not resting so much as simply stopping, allowing the night to catch up with you before you continued on the last stretch toward the cottage and the drove road beyond. When you pushed off from the stump and resumed walking, the path felt firmer underfoot, the peat here mixed with the gravel and sand of the high ground near the cottage. The reeds began to thin, giving way to tussocks of coarse grass and patches of low heather that looked black in the twilight, and you could see the dark shape of the cottage ahead, its chimney a thin vertical line against the brightening sky. A thin wisp of smoke still rose from the chimney, the remains of the turf fire you had banked before leaving, and the sight of it sent a small quiet warmth through your chest. The cottage was exactly as you had left it, the door still closed, the oiled linen window still dark, the rain barrel at the corner still glimmering with the last of the moonlight. You walked past it without going inside because the poulterer would be waiting at the drove road and the birds needed to be delivered while the morning was still cool. The path beyond the cottage curved to the left and joined a wider track, a cart road of packed gravel and sand that ran east toward King's Lynn and west toward the Great North Road. This was the King's Lynn Drove Road, a thoroughfare that carried goods from the fen country to the markets of the east and south, and it was empty at this hour except for the single cart that stood waiting at the crossroads, its lantern swinging from a hook and its horse a patient grey shape in the half-light. The poulterer, John, was a man of middle age with a face that had been weathered by all the seasons of the Fenland, his skin the color of old oak, and his hands as large and capable as your own. He stood beside the cart with one boot up on the spoke of a wheel, a clay pipe in his teeth that had gone out some time ago, and when he saw you coming he raised a hand in a gesture that was less a wave than a simple acknowledgement, the greeting of men who had done business in every weather and needed few words. You walked up to the cart and lowered the sacks from your shoulders onto the tailboard, the straw rustling inside, and John took each sack with a practice swing and set it into the bed among the empty crates. He did not count the birds or weigh them. He knew by the look of the sacks and the way you eased them down that the catch was as it should be, and he nodded once, a short downward dip of the chin that expressed satisfaction and acceptance and the completion of a transaction, all in one motion. From the pocket of his heavy driving coat, John took a small purse of coins, the leather dark and soft with use, and he handed it to you without ceremony, the weight of it settling into your palm with a familiar clink. You did not count the coins either. The amount was understood between you, a price that had been set by years of custom and that varied only when the London market surged or fell, which it had not done recently. You slipped the purse into your own coat pocket, where it made a small bulge against the snares pouch, and then John reached into the cart and brought out a little paper packet of tea, a small luxury that came up from London and that you could not get in the fen villages, and a fresh loaf of wheaten bread wrapped in a clean cloth. You took these gifts with a nod that matched his own, the tea packet tucked into your satchel, the loaf cradled in the crook of your arm, its crust still faintly warm from the bakehouse oven. The two of you stood for a moment in the grey dawn light, the horse blowing soft plumes of steam, the lantern swinging gently, the cart creaking as the wood cooled. John asked after the fen, and you said it was quiet, and he said that was good, and you asked after the roads, and he said they were dry, and that was the extent of the conversation, both of you satisfied that everything that needed saying had been said. John climbed onto the cart seat and took up the reins, clicking his tongue at the horse, and the cart lurched forward with a jingle of harness and a creak of wheels. You watched it roll away toward the London road, the birds jostling gently in their straw beds, destined now for Leadenhall Market and the tables of merchants and clerks, who would never see the moonlit mere where they had been caught. The cart grew smaller and smaller until it was a dark dot on the pale ribbon of the road, and then it rounded a bend and was gone, leaving only the fading sound of hoofbeats on packed gravel and the distant chime of the lantern bell. You stood on the drove road for a little while longer, the fresh loaf in your arm and the tea in your satchel and the purse of coins in your pocket, and you felt the quiet completion that comes when a long task is finished, a sense of closure that was not joy or relief, but simply the falling of a weight that you had not realized you were carrying. The sun, which had been a faint promise in the east for the past hour, now lifted over the sea of reeds with a suddenness that was always surprising, its rim a bright gold line that swelled into a half-disk and then a full disk, filling the world with pale gold light that flooded the fen and turned every reed head and every blade of grass and every pool of standing water into a thing of extraordinary beauty. The mist that had lingered in the ditches began to burn off, rising in thin white streamers that caught the sunlight and became luminous. And the first birds of the day began to call, a skylark climbing into the air with its ceaseless chattering song, a sedge warbler scratching out its mechanical notes from a bush of bog myrtle, a curlew far off with that long liquid call that had been the first sound of the evening and was now the last sound of the night. The fen was waking up, the diurnal world taking over from the nocturnal, and you turned away from the drove road and walked back along the track toward the cottage, your body ready for rest, your work complete. The cottage door opened with the same groan of iron hinges, and you stepped inside to find the room exactly as you had left it, the fire a bed of white ash with a single pulsing heart of peat, the candle cold in its holder, the nets hanging from the rafters in their familiar shapes. You set the loaf and the tea on the shelf, hung your coat on its peg and your hat on its hook, and knelt by the hearth to coax the fire back to life with a handful of dry weed straw and a few gentle breaths. The flame caught and spread, small at first and then larger, and the warmth began to fill the small room, pushing back the chill of the night. You sat on the three-legged stool, your hands resting on your knees, and you looked out the small window at the dawn spreading over the fen, the gold light deepening and the sky turning from grey to a pale, clean blue. Your eyes were heavy, and your body was tired in a way that was deeply comfortable, and you knew that you would sleep soon. Sleep the sleep of a man who had walked through the night and done his work well, and returned home with the birds delivered and the coins in his pocket. The fen lay quiet and bright under the rising sun, the same fen it had always been and would always be, and the Fowler sat on his stool with the warmth of the fire on his face and the peace of the morning in his heart, ready now for rest.